Modi government is facing a new source of organized and quite effective political opposition.
Indian media does seem to be obsessed with Pakistan.
The dominant sources for journalism would wish to divert attention onto Pakistan as the repository of threats and problems.
Professor Jake Lynch is one of the most published scholars in the field of peace journalism, author of A Global Standard for Reporting Conflict, winner of the 2017 Luxembourg Peace Prize, and a former BBC World News anchor. He's joining us today from Oxford in the UK, and we have three things to discuss with him. We'll talk to him about the Indian media's obsession with Pakistan, Indian media's regulatory framework, and overall state of the media in the world. So, Professor Lynch, my first question would have been something else, but a latest development has happened, which I want to share with you, and I want your thoughts on that. So, just yesterday, we got information from X and YouTube that they've gotten an order from India's Ministry of Information and Broadcasting, and that they've said that our channel is against India's national security and public order. And that's why they blocked us. And the reason that they gave us that it was one of our videos that we did on cockroach Janta protesters. So this is the environment that we're living in. I want your thoughts on that, and then probably we can deep dive into Indian media. Your thoughts, please.
Well, I think it's a very interesting development. The precise reasons for it, I think, must remain speculative at this stage. But you alluded to the cockroach movement. And of course, the Modi government is facing a new source of organized and quite effective political opposition. And as commentators have noted, it's homing in on an idea which really the Modi government has made its own, which is the definition of what it means to be Indian and the definition of what it means to be India. So perhaps the instinct is to reach for some kind of gesture by way of signaling a clampdown to reiterate control over that kind of portion of the narrative. So they're the contextual factors that may bear upon such a decision. But as I say, the real reasoning for it must all remain a matter of speculation at this stage.
Professor, I was reviewing some of your work. I came across one of your research on 2008 Mumbai attack and how Indian media covered it. And I want to talk to you about where does Indian media stand right now. Back then, there was criticism that it was hyper-nationalistic, jingoistic. And many would say that it has gotten even more jingoistic. Would you agree with that?
Well, I think I would probably seek to take a step back and commentate more generally on relations between media and sources of political power. The signature gesture of many governing authorities is to assert their own authority in the face of an external threat. That is an external other onto which threats and general kind of bad things can be projected. And therefore, political reporting, I used to be a political reporter myself in Westminster, so political reporting becomes very dyadic. It's all a matter of us versus them. Now, that plays into some of the characteristics of news journalism themselves, because, of course, as journalists want to report facts. They don't want to be mistaken for political sources of information. They're trying to give audiences information with which they can reach a view of the respective merits of different accounts by different sources. And therefore, journalists don't want to appear biased. And above all, they don't want to appear one-sided. One of the best and safest ways to avoid appearing one-sided is to hear both sides. So there's a kind of deep dyadic structure to news journalism, and that can then be instrumentalized by political sources in order to deepen the divide and project everything that goes wrong onto an external other. And I think that's a dynamic which is very recognizable, not only from the coverage by Indian media of the Mumbai attack in 2008, but also in general. And it's a characteristic which they share, it must be said, with many media in many other places.
So you mentioned about this us versus them phenomenon. Do you think that this characteristic or this underlying reason that is dictating all of this, it is an orchestrated one, or do you think that this is organic because media houses are owned by corporate organizations and they realize that this narrative is probably it makes it easier for them to attract eyeballs, or is it like an orchestrated political strategy?
Well, I worked in the BBC, and I was a political correspondent for Sky News, and they were, and I think remain, fairly widely recognised as relatively independent, i.e., not directly controlled by people allied with governing authorities. But nonetheless, this dyadic pattern was highly recognisable. Look, I mean, journalists tell themselves we just report facts, but the thing is, in politics in particular, many facts are created and, as it were, provided for journalists to report. How do those sources know what kind of facts to provide? They do so by drawing inferences from previous reporting. So the facts a journalist will meet today bear a residue of the reporting they and their colleagues did yesterday. Now, that is bolted on to a hierarchy of sources in which, of course, those closest to official corridors of power usually take the cardinal agenda-setting position. You know, woe betide the reporter who misses the ministerial statement, for example. So these are the kind of structural characteristics which are there to be instrumentalized by either governing authorities or other sources of power which want to set up these dyads in order to legitimize what they themselves are doing by projecting all the bad things onto the external other.
Yeah, the reason I asked you this question is because there is another manifestation of this strategy, and that is in the shape of a complete media takeover. We see this in India, or we can also see a manifestation of that in the US as well, where we are now hearing that that CNN is bracing for a takeover, another company buying it, and this would probably CNN is probably the last bastion for the left or the moderate politics. But specifically in India, we've seen that in the last 4 or 5 years, I think the last channel that was to go down was NDTV, which was taken over by a pro BJP Modi's ally. And since then, mainstream media, or the legacy media as you would call it, it's been largely controlled by the forces that are pro-government. So do you think that this is also a strategy that was initially implemented in India, but it's now being replicated world over?
I'm not sure it was initiated in India. I think it's been a familiar factor in many places for many years. I mean, I'm a professor at a university in Australia. Australia is notorious for having a high degree of concentration of media ownership. Two of the main metropolitan masthead titles in the legacy media, the Sydney Morning Herald and the Melbourne Age, were taken over a few years ago by the Nine Media Group, which also has Channel 9 on terrestrial television. And they jostle for space on the newsstand with the titles which are owned in every capital city and many other population centres besides in Australia by Rupert Murdoch and News International, or News Corporation it's called there. So that kind of phenomenon of the concentration of ownership of legacy media is a familiar one in many domains, many jurisdictions.
But Professor, if you were to compare it to the world, for example, if I were to give you the Indian example, India has around 400 news channels. And I don't think any other country in the world would have these many news channels. You talk about Australia, the UK, or the USA, they all have like 4 to 5 main news channels. But India has around 400 channels. And for Modi regime or the government to take over all those 400 channels, that's what the experts believe, that the legacy media is taken over by pro-BJP elements. For them to do that, it does look like that there's something sinister at play.
Sure. And, a lot of it works by privileged access, doesn't it? Privileged access to decision makers. You're talking about news channels. I'd imagine there's a fair degree of cross-ownership between those that produce news and those that produce other programming, entertainment programming, with bigger budgets, more investment capital at stake, and closeness to regulation and those in regulatory structures and decision-making positions is a common currency. Now, of course, India is on a vastly greater scale than Australia. I'm just trying to do the mental arithmetic. I think it's probably fairly accurate that if Australia has, let's say, a handful of news channels and India has 400 news channels, that probably is a fair estimation of the disparity of population between the two countries. But yes, I mean, the scale is greater, and it does speak to a very widespread phenomenon. But what I think saying to you is that it's integrated with the structure of the industry and the nature of the industry. It's vulnerable to take over, and it has been taken over by a collocation of interests, one of whose saleable assets is without doubt closeness to governing and regulatory authorities. And if you consider the nature of the business, that makes sense.
Yeah, you mentioned cross ownership, and I want to give you an example from Pakistan. It is one of the reasons that many people in Pakistan, they also criticize Pakistani media, because you would have traditional newspapers owners venturing into TV channels, broadcast media, and now taking over digital media platforms as well. So that is something that has happened in Pakistan as well, but that is something that the corporate organizations are doing. I want to talk to you about your research, your peace journalism theory. You've done extensive work on this. If you can explain what this peace journalism is.
Well, the peace journalism model has four main lobes. One of them is that war journalism is orientated towards conflict and war, whereas peace journalism is orientated towards peace and process. Another one is that war journalism is typically elite orientated and another propaganda orientated. And I say that because those go together. And that's really embedded in the structure of news industries, that elite sources are generally taken as the prime sources of news. And so the incentive for news organizations is to reproduce those statements without too much interrogative content, because that means they're more likely to get favorable treatment in the future. So those tend to go together, whereas peace journalism is people-oriented and truth-oriented. So it's very likely to reach out to sub-elite sources to piece together accounts of how conflicts have developed, why they have taken the course they have, and crucially, the potential to divert them towards a non-violent outcome instead. And lastly, of course, you get the familiar pattern with war journalism of saturation coverage during a violent episode, then everything goes quiet when that comes to an end. So it's a matter of astonishment when it flares up again, because in the meantime, we've lost track of what the process was that was leading to the conflict in the first place.
So using your own peace journalism theory, where would you put Indian mainstream media on the spectrum that you mentioned? Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a predominant pattern of war journalism, not only in Indian mainstream media, but many mainstream media.
Even during peace times, there is no active war going on. I mean, India is not involved in any conflict right now, but the media still is in a jingoistic mode. Is that what you're trying to say?
Yeah, I mean, conflict we can define to differentiate it from combat, as it were. Conflict is a contradiction. It's two or more parties who have or believe they have contradictory goals. And of course, the idea that India and Pakistan have contradictory goals, for instance, is an idea that can be used and instrumentalized to justify all sorts of political decision-making. And that's what's going on in periods when there is ostensibly periods of peace. It's not really peace, it's a negative peace, a peace that can be got by refraining from doing things. There's nothing wrong with it. I don't mean to have that as a pejorative term. Many people understandably yearn for a ceasefire, for instance, in the situation they're in. That would be negative peace. But positive peace, building understanding, establishing links and structures which make a lapse or a relapse into war less thinkable, that is something which is unfortunately in abeyance at the moment with India's international relations, and therefore, that's how you're seeing the media used in that sense.
So one assumption is that the media organizations world over, they resort to such hyper nationalistic or jingoistic narratives is because that the audience tends to buy it. And in academic circles we talk about confirmation biases, and The argument is that media organizations are doing this because people really want to hear this narrative, and it confirms their biases, this us versus them thing that you mentioned. So do you think that the audience trends, they are also a reason that they're dictating or forcing these organizations to do this?
Well, I do think, media have become much more fragmented. Since I joined as a reporter over 30 years ago, and yes, there is a tendency for audiences to seek out um, or to avoid attitude discrepant material, as it's called, and therefore seek out the kind of channels and newspapers that agree with their own views. So I mentioned a few minutes ago the Murdoch media in Australia, for instance, and it's particularly vociferous in Melbourne, in the state of Victoria. And at the last Victoria state election, it was widely assumed that the governing Labour administration would lose the election purely because of the depth and viciousness of the persistent attacks on it by the Murdoch media. But in fact, actually, the election result was a virtual replica of the previous one, because those who have been paying attention to these Murdoch media were people who had already made up their mind to oppose that government anyway. So there is that. But yes, I mean, the energy which is often the most promising around the fringes of the mainstream media is the alternative media. And of course, it used to be said that the freedom of the press belonged to people who could afford to own one. Well, now the equivalent of the press is just having a web-based operation, which pretty much anyone can own. Then the premium becomes gaining attention in an attention economy. And so if you can pull that trick off, if you can have an independent media outlet and gain attention in the attention economy, then you can start to push into the public sphere a set of heterodox perspectives. And, one could point to examples in the jurisdictions I know best, certainly in Australia, such as Pearls and Irritations and Michael West Media, or in the UK, such as Open Democracy and the Byline Times. These are factors in the mediascape which are presently marginal, but nonetheless exert a relatively big influence compared with their circulation and their capitalization.
When I turn on Pakistani TV screens during the prime time, we don't usually see India as a topic of discussion. It's a very rarely, if there's a news item, then you would have it in the news or in the current affairs shows. But if you were to switch on Indian media, you would find that every other day it is about Pakistan. And the assumption, or probably it's fair to say, that Indian media is somewhat obsessed with Pakistan. And considering the fact India is a large country, it has a huge economy, Pakistan has its own problems, but still Indian media does seem to be obsessed with Pakistan. Do you agree with this assertion that Indian media is somehow obsessed with Pakistan? And also, if you can comment on, if Indian editors were asking you for an advice on how to cover Pakistan using your own peace journalism theory, what would be your advice to them?
Well, first of all, yes, I think there are lots of reasons. There are lots of reasons why the dominant sources for journalism would wish to divert attention onto Pakistan as the repository of threats and problems against which a notion of dominant or mainstream Indian identity can be asserted. And that bears a political dividend in the kind of political context we see in India with the Modi government at the moment. So if the interests of sources lie in that direction, then it's not entirely surprising, especially given the widespread alignment of media ownership with the same people who constitute the sources. It's not entirely surprising that we perceive that pattern in media coverage. As far as peace journalism is concerned, I would encourage Indian media and Pakistan media to concentrate on people-level connections, areas of commonality and common interest, try to look through and past the official sources, which pretty much say the same things every day. It's not entirely surprising the kind of things they're providing in order to serve up something novel and thought-provoking to audiences. We're more likely to see that in alternative media at the moment than in corporate mainstream media.
Professor Jake Lynch, thank you so much for joining us.